Welcome to another episode of the Golden Hour. I'm Sharif Yunus here with Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, it's great to have you back on.
Hey, Sharif, it's great to be here again.
So, Kevin, I wanted to ask you a question, but it seems like oftentimes working with people or in general, people get very stressed, whether it's students or professionals. I want to understand what's the science of stress? Kind of what's behind that?
It's a big topic, of course, and the idea of feeling stressed. What does that even mean? Last May, Nature Communications had this fascinating study where they'd actually worked out now what's happening inside the brain when people are subjectively feeling stressed versus facing challenges and not being stressed. Uh, and what we know now is that in the really big picture, people are stressed out when they're getting ready to avoid things. And that feeling substantially decreases as they start to approach things. That's like the main message actually from that, from the it's talking about the hippocampal connectome and talking about these different imaging techniques that they used. But by and large, if when people are getting stressed, they then engage it with work using your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the feeling of stress goes down and goes away. Yeah, but while you're still just stuck spinning wheels and some kind of just like wishing you could escape, so then you constantly get stressed. You could actually say at some level that when people are really stressed is when they're in a state of thwarted escape. They wish they could get out of some situation and they can't. And it starts stressing them, and their poor adrenal glands start flexing and just releasing all this adrenaline, and it's not going anywhere, not doing anything because they're in a state of thwarted escape. And it's like they're just spinning in their head, thinking things over, versus really just engaging life. Stop and then like just to stop worrying about it and to stop all worrying and start engaging.
So, would you say that the number one symptom of stress is this kind of worrying?
Yeah, that's the behavior. Yeah. I think worrying really is the spinning the wheels in the head. And so it's that people are just going over things, but it's not in any productive way or even like at a productive time to consider it. So they might be worrying while they're driving or showering or preparing a meal or doing something, but not like to actually sit down and address the thing, which would be then working it, which would mean being less stressed. So it's pretty cool that if you just like are spinning the wheels in your head, thinking things over, but not really getting anywhere, you're in the state of thwarted escape. You're trying to escape, but you aren't. And that's what stresses you. And now we have really good data like that this model, which is always kind of what we talked about in optimal work about approach and avoidance and how essential that is really, I think, just getting clearer and clearer.
Yeah, it reminds me too of the active passive challenge ratio, that really what matters is the ratio of how much are you actively challenging yourself compared to the challenges that you're facing. And the more you try to reduce the challenge and avoid challenges, that then sends the ratio off to infinity. So then you feel that as stress.
Maybe just to like to say what that is, that this was our formula for being stressed and overwhelmed. Is basically you think of all the ways in life in which you're feeling like you're being challenged, which we call passive challenge, versus how much are you actively challenging yourself in life? And that's active challenge. And it's only when you have more of the passive kind than the active kind that you start feeling stressed and overwhelmed. And then sometimes people get into this thing of trying to escape the challenges. And when they do that, they stop challenging themselves. And then the ratio of passive to active goes to infinity.
Of these topics, I'm kind of most interested to dig into the idea of worrying, kind of what's going on in people's heads when that happens, what's going on in my head when I do it. But yeah, maybe just kind of some background. I mean, worrying, it seems like something everyone intuitively knows about and something that they do. Is this something that has a kind of technical definition in psychology that might surprise people, or is it just kind of there as a phenomenon that we know?
Probably within cognitive behavioral therapy, the way that we define worrying is it's a thought pattern that's repetitive and intrusive and anxiety provoking, but is not completely irrational or involuntary. And the reason we do that is that if essentially it's like some real life thing that, yeah, worrying in that sense makes sense. And a lot of times it's kind of voluntary that people are thinking that somehow they're better off worrying about things. And they think that it's doing some kind of good, preventing badness, catastrophes. So, and this is distinguish it from what are called obsessions. Obsessions are also repetitive and intrusive and anxiety provoking, but they're irrational and involuntary. So the prototype would be, say, a young mother afraid of, throwing her child out the window or something, and as horrible as that is, it's not rational and it's not something that most people would be concerned about. Everyone could have a thought that's crazy cross their mind from time to time, and that's considered perfectly normal. But what happens is some people get really, really afraid of those thoughts when they occur, and they try not to ever have them again. And then they become more repetitive and intrusive the more they fight them. So if the thought is repetitive, intrusive, anxiety provoking, and also irrational and involuntary, then it's an obsession. A worry is about a real life thing, so it's rational, semi voluntary at least, but it's repetitive and intrusive, and it's a huge drag on your ability to work. It keeps you in threat mode. Even if your job isn't putting you in threat mode, then having some prominent worry on your mind does keep you in threat mode so that you just stay kind of charged. And this is, stressed. And then but the other thing about worrying is that when people are doing it, it's when it's usually not the right time to be trying to deal with it. They could be laying in bed at night, and that's not the time to be working it. They could be doing something else. So the problem is that it just occupies their background attention and keeps them in threat mode, but doesn't actually do anything useful. So it's just spinning the wheels. And that's really both obsessing and worry. That's the problem.
What are the kind of common ways that people deal with this problem? I mean, I can think of two. Maybe thinking, okay, there's no point in worrying. Let me just solve the problem.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah, that you want to see, how can I work this? And to think of work as the way to engage whatever the worry is. And so, like, if you're worried about, say you got a bad annual review, and you're kind of worried about your future, it's better to ask, hey, how can I work this? How can I strategize my performance to improve it? And then, it might be, okay, I'm going to collect more feedback from others around me. I'm going to look back in my annual review more, and I'm going to become specific in how I address these things and make a plan for each one. Well, that wouldn't be worrying anymore. It'd just be actually addressing the problem in a kind of, and that's a super healthy approach then. So if you can work a problem, then you form a strategy. And then the strategy, as you are employing it, it starts to give you a feeling of traction. That's the opposite of the spinning the wheels. Getting real traction in addressing the issue is completely the reverse of worrying about it. So if you can work it, you need to work it. But sometimes people could worry about things that there's nothing for them to do. And so there's really no like strategy or plan that they can do. Like you think of a person like a parent who has say their child is off to a war zone to fight, and okay, there nothing that they can do to keep their child safe, and it might be that they're worrying about it, and it's on their mind a lot, but there's nothing to do, then they have to be able to let go of it.
Couldn't they, for example, pray for? I mean, it seems like you shouldn't just do nothing, like out of sight, out of mind. It seems like if you have a
Well,
your
that's
child is in a
yeah,
war zone, maybe
yeah,
there's
that's exactly. So I think then, even there's something beautiful about that answer you're suggesting, which is it's so simple, it has only one step. And all the plans of simplicity have just one step. And then you can always do that step. And so it's true that, yeah, that could be a way of continually drawing the best out of it. But there's a there and that would be the most simple approach, I guess. is, but simplicity is, a wonderful ideal to see, okay, how do I deal with this in a more simple way? But, and then it's always, there's some simple step you can do.
So I wanted to get your thoughts on, are there any we've now kind of discussed the healthy ways of, or at least started to discuss the healthy way of dealing with worry. Are there any typical kind of traps people fall into when dealing with worry? And what one other that I was thinking of was, if you think, well, I'll just distract myself from this worry. I'll just watch TV or watch hours and hours of Netflix or play video games or something to distract myself from this concern. That would seem to be an unhealthy way of dealing with worrying. So is it? I assume it is. And then what exactly are the problems that follow from that? And then are there any other kind of these unhealthy responses to it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the main way, way people try dealing with worry is distracting themselves. And that probably works like 80% of the time. And probably, I would think the number one way they do that is actually with work. So they kind of just get into their work. But when people rely on work as a distractor, they can't take vacations. Because as soon as they go on a vacation, then they end up worrying about everything. There's no way to rest. So that is proof positive that a person has an issue in worrying is they have trouble on vacations, because it means they had been using work as a buffer against their own habit of worrying. So I think the worrying itself, though, just like as a deeper point, worrying itself is a form of distraction. In fact, they're not addressing the real issue, nor are they feeling their emotion and letting it simply be there. Instead, they're occupying their brain with words, and they keep going over words in their head. And the words in the head are the essence of the worry. You can't worry in silence. If you had complete inner silence, there couldn't be worrying at that moment. So worrying is words in the head. It's always, you can actually, that's when you see it in the fMRI machine, it's in precisely a verbal center, in the left half of the brain, right up there in the frontal cortex, this verbal processing is just like a hyper verbal processing where people are playing words in their heads over and over and not attending to the feeling or addressing and working the actual situation. So uh, maybe I've mentioned this before when we talked about worry, but I always say warriors are decapitated. That they never feel the emotion in their body, particularly in their chest. They don't feel the emotion at all. If you ask them, like, where when you're worrying, what do you feel? And they'll say, I feel stressed, and maybe anxious. Okay, where do you feel it? Yeah, in my head. Okay, if and, like that in my experience, that has been essentially like diagnostic. This person's way of dealing with stressors is to worry about them. And so I'm not saying they have a problematic worry, or I'm not saying that they have a diagnosis from it, but just as different ways you can experience anxiety, and shunting it into worrying is one pathway. And then the result is it's really hard for people to feel their emotions in their chest, which means it's really hard for them to process them in a healthy way and retrain their amygdala by approaching the things while they feel the emotion.
Now, when you talk about feeling the emotion and you talk about thoughts going on in your head, my mind immediately jumps to mindfulness. So hopefully I didn't give anything away. But how do we use then mindfulness as a solution to the worrying? Are you saying we should use mindfulness to get to the underlying thing, to be willing to feel it? Or should we also use mindfulness to settle our minds when we notice that our thoughts are kind of running and we're starting to worry? Or how exactly should we engage this?
Yeah, so I think the real issue generally, and when people are worrying, is that there is some thought triggering a feeling that's leading them to want to escape in some way, and to solve it. Uh, so the ultimate worst way of dealing with it, I would say, is mindlessly getting reassurance. Going to others like, "Are you sure this is okay? Are you sure that this will?" And then reassurance makes, the whole thing go away temporarily, but then it comes right back. And so, it when people have real problematic worry, it's practically enough just to stop reassurance seeking, and you have to starve it. And then they feel an agony as they're not getting reassurance, but it's a healing kind of agony. If they just welcome the emotions and then are mindful of feeling them, then in fact, it's not even that painful. So mindfulness does a couple things. One is by focusing on something like your breath, you can attain silence in your head. Now, worrying is a verbal phenomenon. So this is the silent cure. You, in a sense, in the moment, cure worrying or ruminating if it's about the past. Worrying is usually about the future. In a sense, you address it, cure it with silence. And the best way of attaining silence is learning how to use the breath, slowing down the breath real slow. So, at least 5.5 seconds in, 5.5 seconds out, and breathing through the nose, not the mouth. And then opening up to feel the sensations in the front of the chest, which is where the tension gets put by your amygdala when you are facing a stressor. Just staying with it for a few slow breaths, not big, just nice and easy and relatively shallow breaths. You just open up and you kind of learn to give your amygdala a message received signal. Okay, yeah, there's something here that is a threat and it's okay. And you settle into it. I've had patients tell me that when they learn how to tap in and feel the sensation of the anxiety in their chest, it just unplugs the whole worry machine in their head. It's like they just feel like all the energy just gets drained from the worrying upstairs. And then now they can just process it in just, it might be a minute or less, it might be a couple minutes or a few minutes. The idea isn't to make the feeling go away totally. It's actually just to stop the spinning of the wheels in the head. Worry then is like a negative habit of not really addressing things. Instead, you want to clear it out and then come up with it's how do you actually make a real strategy for addressing this if you can? Because the real opposite, and this is what that nature communication study was showing, when people are instead of just going into your avoidance response and trying to get the wheel spinning in their head, instead are like actively strategizing whatever the stressor is, then they feel much less stressed. It's a whole different network. And that's precisely what, you turn it into a golden hour. You turn it into a project. You turn it into work. And so you just come up with what are going to be the steps I'm going to use to really address this. And if people do that and they start strategizing it and then do the plan, they start getting real traction in addressing the thing. And then that again is the complete opposite of the spinning of the wheels.
That's interesting. Is there a similar kind of underlying mechanism when you're thinking, okay, I'm going to distract myself with work versus now I'm going to go to actually start working on the problem? That in both cases, it seems like the stress goes away. Obviously, in one case, you're doing the right thing because you're actually working on the problem to be solved. In the other case, you're doing the wrong thing because you're just distracting yourself from the actual important problem.
My guess though is that when people are using work to as a distractor, they're actually doing more, it's much more likely that they're going to be just getting things done, like doing busy things. They're going to be going down rabbit holes and hyper focus. I don't think they're going to be doing real golden hours. Because the first step of golden hour is trying to see how is this next hour of work giving me the best opportunity possible to grow and to serve others. Well, if there is something that's really important that you're worrying about and you could do something, maybe then that would come up. So I feel like when people are misusing work, they're actually misworking as well. Like the actual form of the work wouldn't be as good. They wouldn't really be reframing, they wouldn't really be practicing mindfulness, and they wouldn't really be challenging themselves in the way they most need to challenge themselves.
Great. And then last question is So we've kind of centered on mindfulness here, but it seems to me that reframing also has a key role, which is to be detached from the outcome. If you're worried about a particular bad outcome that you fear in some way, right? So there seems to be an important role then in just being up for whatever ends up happening. Okay, even if this presentation goes really poorly, well, how can I learn from that? Or how can I grow during that experience? So what role do you see the reframing playing in connection with mindfulness?
I think that reframing is always, in a way, the first step because that's where you're trying to see what's the wider context that where I can get enthused about growing in some way. And so it could be that, um, let's say that you're going to be playing another team in soccer, and you're really afraid that they have this new superstar player, and you're kind of worrying that he's going to show up. Okay, so it might be that, yeah, if this guy shows up, your team would lose the game. So you could kind of be worrying about that, but then you could also think, okay, how do I widen the context here? Even if he does show up, does that give me a better opportunity to grow? And in fact, it does. So you have to like keep thinking, like, I don't know why I came up with that example. I'm not a soccer player myself, but the idea is you could be worrying about some difficulty that actually is just you have to take that into account and see, given that, just assume it will happen. Then how do you have the best way of growing? And I think that's exactly like what you're talking about. Like you have to get your mind around, okay, accept that the bad thing might occur, but then what would you do? So, and how would you still see that as a way of growing? So you don't get kind of attached to an outcome, but stay focused on the right kind of process that somehow matters the most.
That's great. Well, actually, just kind of short testimonial. While you were talking earlier, I started worrying that I wasn't going to be able to think of a next question to ask. So I started tuning into my breath a little bit and feeling the anxiety, and then actually came up with a couple of questions afterwards. So that was, thank
So
you for that advice. It already paid off.
it works even in
Yeah,
the moment.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah. And so I think, yeah, but you probably also like are used to having strategies for how you think about these things, and so you got back to the strategies. And the other thing just about reframing, as you were talking, I was thinking that doing things in a new and better way is, it's another great way to think. Like, how can I deal with this, whatever the thing I tend to worry about, in a new way, in a better way? Just to be opening up creativity and flexibility about it. Flexibility, so you're not just getting your heart set on one outcome only being right, but then also creativity in how you approach this thing.
great note to end on, Kevin, because we're out of time. But
All right, Sharif, thanks so much.
yeah, we'll be back next week.
Take care.